Hi there. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the the mill fires we had in Waits River. One of them was, the first one that in my lifetime was in 1953. And then the mill got rebuilt and it burned again 8 years later, 61, I think. I'm going to talk about the first fire because that's the one that did the most damage and really just changed the face of that little town. Flint brothers had owned that property there for quite a while. They had a operation there where they were making bobbins for the woolen industry, and they shipped them. They mostly made rough bobbins, and then I think they sent a bunch of them down to East Corinth and had them finished down there. But so they were making rough bobbins up here. Originally that was a sawmill. It was an old building, probably built in the late 1800s or somewhere in there. Old ramshackle building, nothing but a tinderbox. But I'm not really sure how they thought it started. It's a great big building, like 2-3 stories high and long, and just a big warehouse full of bone-dry bobbins and firewood and sawdust. I'm not exactly sure how the fire started. I should know because it's probably well known, but I was just a little kid. I was 5 years old in 1953, so I guess I didn't know too much at the time. I know that when the fire got started, my mother grabbed Rachel and I and Doris and took us up to just across the brook and up away from our house a little bit to a place that was owned by an elderly English couple by the name of Spooner or Spoonire or something. They were nice old people. Anyway, we're up there on the lawn at our house, where we lived right across the river, facing the mill, and you could feel the heat starting to build. As a matter of fact, it cracked a couple of our windows. So it got really hot. Started a fire on our side of the river. It just swept through that building unbelievably. I mean, I can remember just huge plumes of smoke and debris going, because it had a damn tar paper roof on it, and huge chunks of flaming tar paper would go twirling off out through, way up in the air. I remember when the smokestack fell, we watched that fall, and it fell across the river and part of it landed on our property, and that's kind of what started a little grass fire down there. My dad at the time was working in East Corinth at Bowen Hunter Bobbin Company. And when they got word down there, they turned a whole crew loose, which was at that time probably 50, 60 men, and told them to come up and help with the fire up here to see what they could do to help. So Dad was home, and Milton Partington lived right next door to us, and he and Dad worked together to keep the the grass fires down, so it didn't get near the buildings. And if anything happened, the two of them worked together on it. But again, I was just a little kid. I was sitting up on the lawn up there, but it was a devastating fire. I mean, it just flattened that mill, just tore through there, and it burned for a week or more, because there was big piles of bobbins in there, hardwood bobbins that just burned and burned and burned. Up just between the road and the mill was the Waits River store. At that time, it was owned by Anna and Waldo Hood. It's a nice old New England store, where the guys would sit around the Cracker Barrel type of thing. Nice old store, nice people. But when that mill got going, there was no real, I don't think they didn't have a Tri-Village Fire Department at that time. That's what initiated the starting of that Tri-Village Fire Department. They did have some kind of an old beat up fire truck that rolled in there that nobody knew how to run anything. I mean, initially. But it burned that store flat. Right next to it was where my relatives lived. Bragg's, my Eleanor Chalmers, she married a Bragg. He was the mailman, and that was right there. And they didn't have a prayer. It just swept through that set of buildings. This Bragg, Sherman Bragg, he came up through as the fire was going on, and he grabbed a bunch of his kids and headed them up. I think he took them up to my grandmother's, up the road a mile, dumped them off. And my grandmother said he looked like a man that was just seen a ghost when he came up there, because he knew his all of his possessions, everything were just gone. He didn't have a chance to get anything. And it really screwed that family over pretty bad, because they ended up, after that they lost everything. So it took a while for them to get their feet back under them. Luckily, Sherm had a good job at the time. So that took out the store and one of the premier houses in the town. The fire there was a little house down below there, Victor Welch's, where the Welches lived, or he just moved, hadn't been there long. And it caught fire, but I think they got it out. They paid attention and got that out. It got into the Sawyer's barn, which is still there. Got into that a little bit, and they were all over that. By that time, they had enough men with buckets of water so they could put stuff out. They saved that barn. Across the road, the church steeple was up high enough so it caught a lot of that trash and heat from the mill, and it just caught the steeple on fire. Well, I know my grandfather was up in there, and I think Kenneth Perry, and I almost think Bud Ottoman might have been involved. There's quite a few people that were trying to help, of course, but up in that steeple, just a ladder going up in there, and somebody had to go way up in there. They took up one of those pumps that the fire department uses for forest fires. They took that off up in there, and they managed to get that out, but it burned the hell out of that steeple, and it just drooped down over like a clown's hat. It had a little ball on the end of it. That drooped down over, looked all the world like a clown's hat. But they saved the church, and they were able to redo the steeple, and that was not a great big deal, but it could have burned the church right down. Just beyond, let's see, on the side of the road where Sawyer's is now, if you're going north, on the left-hand side of the road, down below Sawyer's, there was Dan Morrison had a blacksmith shop down there. And that burned that flat. Something come in there and landed in there and got that going. They didn't catch it quick enough, so that burned. There was also another barn that set right in the road, and I think that burned. I'm not sure about that, but I know the blacksmith shop burned. And then just down below that on the other side of the road where, that little yellow house in there, at the time of it, I'm not sure who lived there, but anyway, it burned that place flat. And my grandfather's wife, second wife, bought the property and rebuilt there, built that little yellow house after the fire. But God, there was 2 forest fires that got started down below there. And there was an untold amount of damage. Just people's lives were changed, and it was just a horrible situation. And it was later in the summer, but the crew at the mill didn't really get hurt, because some of them were there trying to work on the fire. But they also rebuilt it afterwards. I think probably Frost, can't think of his name now. But anyway, Frost had a company that probably got involved in helping rebuild the mill. I know they rebuilt the store with Bob Macklin was working for Elmer Frost back then, and he's the one that decided to put a store back up, and he worked with Frost, and they rebuilt the store, rebuilt the mill, much smaller mill, but rebuilt that. And the Bragg home, that just, you could smell that fire, you could smell that char in there for a decade afterwards. I used to walk by there, was a path that went by there when I'd go to the store to buy myself a Snickers. You go by there and you could smell it, still smell it in that cellar hole. But eventually they put a trailer in there and Eleanor moved into that. So the other buildings that got burned, it didn't really matter too much. They built back where my grandfather's second wife lived there. The little blacksmith shop just never was rebuilt, so that wasn't any big deal. There was damage. People suffered quite a lot, but like I say, the mill helped, just kept it on working. They cleaned it all up and rebuilt it whatever they needed and went on with life. But my God, that town was a fire. I mean, my Aunt Margaret lived across the road up above the church. I had a little house up there, and she said she was so scared because there was so much smoke and flames that she couldn't look. She didn't know what was going on across the river where we lived. She couldn't tell if we were on fire over there or not. She said she was just sick about it. And a lot of people were trying to help, but no organization. I mean, nothing like that had ever happened before. And they didn't really have an organized fire department, but fire departments came from the Bowen Hunter fire truck came up, and they came over from Barrie, and they had plenty to do when they got here anyway. And that was in 1953. Like I said, they rebuilt the mill, and 8 years later the goddamn thing burned down again, but this time it didn't do much. But I'll tell you about that sometime. I was a little older then, and old enough to get my nose stuck into that deal. But that's the fire of 1953 that burned down the Flint Brothers Mill in Waits River. Thank you.